Hi, I'm Paul Motz, Director of the Westland Youth Assistance Program, and thank you for joining us today for another episode of the Westland Youth Assistance Overview. I have two wonderful guests today, and they have a lot of great information to share. To my left, I have Dr. Cornelius James, and to my right, I have Attorney Leonard Mungo. And gentlemen, if you could introduce yourselves. Doctor, if you could go first.
Well, I'm Dr. Cornelius James. I'm a recent graduate of Wayne State University School of Medicine. Currently a internal medicine and pediatrics resident at William Beaumont Hospital.
And I'm Attorney Leonard Mungo, and I am in private practice, and I also serve as an elder at the Annapolis Park Church of Christ.
Now, gentlemen, Leonard, I've known you for a good number of years, and you're the one who approached me and said, look, I have this great young doctor. He's full of information, and it's so important that we really have to deliver it to the parents of our kids. And it's parents and the adolescent brain. So if you could just share a little bit with your relationship with Dr. James here.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. Dr. James is we're just very blessed to have him. He is a longtime acquaintance, and he serves as one of our deacons at the Annapolis Park Church of Christ. And we've had for some while concern with how to help our parents better parent, of course using biblical principles, but nonetheless the same challenges that every parent would have with their child. We felt a need to really put a lot of work into developing our parent-youth ministry, and in doing so we found it necessary to teach our children about law. So we would actually take them to visit the courts. They would actually sit with the judges. In fact, Judge Bokos was very gracious in having our young men in to sit with him as he adjudicated cases, visit the police department, so that they'll really have a sense for what law enforcement is and why it's important to respect the law. About finances, we actually took them to visit the New York Stock Exchange. Sex and hygiene, Dr. James, although he was in medical school at the time, along with one of our other elders, Dr. O'Neill, would take our young men through sex and hygiene classes, and of course we dealt with the issue of violence and self-defense, and of course drugs. We bring in law enforcement, and then of course communication skills in terms of how parents can be more effective in communicating with their children, so as to provide them with more skills and abilities to raise their children effectively and keep them out of the criminal justice system and becoming statistics otherwise, teenage pregnancies, etc. So along this way, we, Dr. James, developed just the perfect instrument, a teaching instrument and presentation to help parents really understand that it takes more than just energy to raise a child properly and to be effective in nurturing them into healthy, mature, productive adults. And he did this sermon one day on the parents and the teen brain, which was a mixture of scriptures and science. And we just thought it was just so powerful. We said, man, everybody needs to know about this. And I know Dr. Dobson wrote a book called Parenting is Not for Cowards. And he had a little small section in there on that addressed the hormonal issues. But the treatment that Dr. James gives this issue is just, I mean, we're just really blessed. I think this community is blessed to have his talent, his ability, his insights put together in such a way that the least among us can understand the role that the brain plays and how important it is for parents to understand something about the brain.
So this is for our parents and our caregivers, and this is amazing because I was really impressed by you because you're such a nice young man, and well, young to me, and I know you're about 30. So through med school and a very nice young family, and right away your main concern is, I want to help our young people, and the best way for me to help our young people is to educate the parents and the caregivers. And it's not just picking up a pamphlet. This is something parents have to work on. As we were talking earlier, the technology and research is always changing, and we're learning more and more. And you have newer information that we want to share. And even though we're going to be talking about parenting and the adolescent brain, you kind of got to lead us up to that, right?
Right.
Okay, well, let's kind of jump into it. What is it you want our parents and caregivers of adolescents to know? I think we have some definitions to do, right?
Right. The title is The Parent and the Adolescent Brain, and we chose that title for this lesson because we realized that a long time ago you couldn't just kind of separate the youth or the adolescents and just have them out on their own, living their lives on their own while the parents are just kind of in the background. Our leadership at Annapolis Park realized that it takes the parents and the adolescents to come together and learn the same things, to understand the same things, so that they can kind of go through this period of their lives together. The adolescents and the parents actually rearing the adolescents. So we titled it The Parent and the Adolescent Brain because, as I said, it's just important for parents to realize that they play a huge role during this period of the adolescent's life. Not trying to say that this is a bad time or anything like that. It's a great time. It can be a very rewarding period of the adolescent's life. I told you earlier, there's two different periods in time where kids or people have a great time to learn. One of those times is when they're very young, as infants or babies, and another time is during this adolescent period, and it's because of those different connections that are being made with those different brain cells. So it's very important. Also, it's just some interesting information about the brain. It's an amazing organ, amazing organ. The brain contains over 10 billion neurons in an adolescent. When they're well developed, over 10 billion neurons in an adolescent brain. There's over 100 billion support cells for these neurons. And then on top of that, between these neurons, there's over 100 trillion connections between these neurons. So that just lets you know how complicated and amazing this organ is. Psychologists have divided the human life into basically three different stages or three different periods. They've divided it into childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. The adolescent portion is what we're going to focus on, of course. And the definition of adolescence is basically this transition between childhood and adulthood. You want to successfully transition your child from a child to become an adult. That's what everyone's goal is, and that's the reason for this whole presentation, is to make sure that we're successfully transitioning our children from childhood to adulthood. And
this is so important and for so many reasons, because it seems like our youth are most vulnerable between the ages of 14 and 24, 12 and 24, and this is really where we see where young people might become incarcerated, or they might become victims of crimes, or they might be perpetrators of crimes because they're not thinking clearly yet, because the brain hasn't developed. Okay.
Right. And so there's a few different things that are going on during this period of adolescence. You mentioned briefly how adolescence is between the ages of 10 to 24. I think it's very important for kids to know, and parents, as a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old, a child can know, okay, I'm getting kind of close to this period of life where things are going to become a little different for me. I think it's important for parents to know and children to know adolescence usually starts between the ages of 10, at about the age of 10. And it goes up until the age of 24. Now, with that said, just because adolescence is over at the age of 24, that doesn't mean that the brain is even completely where it should be. That usually doesn't even happen until you're around 30 years of age, where you have a completely, pretty much mature brain. So adolescence is divided into three stages. Between the ages of 10 to 13, we call that early adolescence, okay? This is usually when puberty starts, between the ages of 10 to 13 years of age. You'll usually see growth of body hair in children. You'll see oil and sweat gland production. That'll increase. You'll see breast development in females. You'll also see the onset of menstruation, which is basically the start of a young girl's period. And boys may even notice that they'll have some changes in their testicles. They'll notice a growth in their testicles. During this early adolescent phase, you'll see that the kids are pretty much interested in only the present. You know, they're not really thinking too far off in the future or thinking of long-term consequences. They're thinking of the present. If they want to go to this movie, they want to go to this movie, and there's nothing else around them. It's kind of hard. It's difficult to get them to see anything else.
So for our parents at home, when your child seems to like, so can I go? Can I go? Can I go? And you're like, I'll tell you later, or like tomorrow. Right. They're just focused on right now. Exactly. They want the answer, and that's why they're so persistent.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So this is also when they have an increased desire for independence. They start to become more interested in, or have an increased sexual interest during this early adolescent stage. During middle adolescent, this is usually between the ages of 14 and 18. Okay, this is usually when puberty is completed. Between the ages of 14 and 18, puberty is typically completed. Now, an adolescent will usually develop the ability to set goals. They'll set long-term goals. They'll also develop some moral reasoning, and they'll continue to adjust to physical changes that are happening to their bodies. This is a very, very interesting time, and a lot of things are changing for adolescents, okay? So we have to realize that, and it takes some adjustment. They also tend to have a greater reliance on friends or peers than they do on their parents. So that's something that most parents can relate to. They'll see, why is it that they tend to want to go out and be with their friends as opposed to wanting to be with the family? Okay, this typically happens during middle adolescence. And again, they have that increased interest in sex. Now, late adolescence is between the ages of 19 and 24. Okay, this is when young men or young women are fully and completely developed. They're fully and completely developed physically, not mentally. We have to realize, not mentally yet. We have to stress that. But young men, they typically continue to develop physically at this point. You know, that's why you may see the high school football player who was a kind of thin guy in high school, but he went off to college and he gained a lot of weight and he starts to look like a man. You know, they're still growing during that period of time while they're in college. They typically have a firmer sense of themselves. They're able to think more abstractly, and they're able to think things through at this point, between this 19 to 24-year-old age. They also show more increased concern for the future, and they show increased emotional stability. Okay. Now,
and just to go back to that emotional stability, and Mr. Mungo, you probably recall kids all the time would just be focused on something else, or they would lose track, or they just become just very upset and cry for no apparent reason. Or if they get upset, the parent might say, "Oh, it's just the hormones talking." So, and this really is going to factor in, because even though it's just a saying, it's the hormones, it really is.
Right. And that leads us into puberty. Puberty is basically when you have these hormones that are starting to kind of get going. Puberty specifically it marks the transition between a relatively quiet reproductive system to an active reproductive system where people are able to reproduce. That's pretty much what puberty is.
And what age is this?
Puberty for girls, it usually starts at the ages maybe between 10 and 11 years old. And for boys, it typically starts a little bit later than that.
And so kids can reproduce at a very young age.
Very young age.
Okay.
Very young age. And another thing that I was going to say, specifically for young ladies, if you're wondering when you're going to start puberty, realize that it's not the onset of your menstruation, which was what medically we call menarche. That's not the start of puberty. It's actually what we call thelarche, which is breast development. That's when puberty actually starts. And now what starts puberty or triggers puberty is not completely understood, but there's some belief that genetic factors may play a role, where a person lives and so on. Those kinds of things may play a role. And another thing that a young girl can consider is asking their mother when they started their period, or their grandmother. Because usually when their mother or grandmother started their period, they can kind of get an idea, okay, I may start around this time too. It does tend to happen like that. Again, puberty in young females, it starts around the age of 10 or 11 years of age. It usually starts with menarche, with thelarche. And menarche, which is marks the beginning of menstruation, it's also when girls are able to reproduce, when they're able to start reproducing. And the average age of menarche is actually 12 in the United States.
Okay. So it's really good that we have, rules and laws set up, and it is truly to protect children. Just because they're able to produce doesn't mean that they're really ready to produce.
Right. Okay. I agree. And for males, if the males are wondering when they typically start puberty, it's usually between the ages of 9 and 14. Okay, so males, if you're wondering when these changes, these physical changes may start to happen, just kind of think between the ages of 19 and 14. And again, it's just so, I believe that it's empowering to know these things. I growing up, I wasn't aware that, okay, I'm 9 years old now. I mean, I may start to experience some changes. But actually knowing these things is very empowering, and it's empowering to the parents as well. But Mr. Mungo brought up a book that was mentioned as far as parenting isn't for cowards. It's not always easy to address these kinds of issues with kids as far as puberty and these physical changes, but it's actually, it has to be done.
Well, especially if you factor in that they're wanting to move away from the parents, they want to become more independent. The friends are so important, and then for the parent to know these things and be able to kind of rope their kids in and kind of bring them back to help them safely through this process.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. So there's an important system that is involved with puberty. It's called the endocrine system. And this endocrine system is basically a system that's composed of a number of different glands. And these glands regulate the body's growth and metabolism and sexual development and function. These glands secrete hormones into the bloodstream, and they may affect one organ or a number of different organs. Okay. In females, you have this axis, or this axis that's called the hypothalamic-pituitary ovarian system. So that's basically saying that you have this part of your brain that's called the hypothalamus, which is interacting with another part of your brain called the pituitary gland. Now, once that hypothalamus becomes active, you start to secrete these hormones that's going to trigger puberty. It's going to activate, these hormones are going to go to the ovaries and trigger some different things to happen in the body. Okay, the same thing happens in males, but you just have testicles as opposed to ovaries. You have this hypothalamic-pituitary testicular axis. You have the same thing. You have the hypothalamus. You have the pituitary. But the end organs, or the thing that these hormones are going to act on at the end, are the testicles as opposed to the ovaries in males. Okay? Now, there's some important hormones that many of us have heard of in females, and there's some important hormones that we've heard of in males. Hormone for females that we usually hear about is estrogen. That hormone typically works throughout the body, and it works basically on the reproductive tract. It's important for the development of secondary sexual characteristics. Primary sexual characteristics include things like just being a male or a female, whereas or having a vagina, or having a penis, or having different sexual organs. Those are primary sexual characteristics. Whereas secondary sexual characteristics, those include things such as hair development, breast development, differences in fat distribution, and hip development in females. Estrogen helps with the development of these secondary sexual characteristics. Whenever you see females who have started to have wider hips, or who've had breast development, that's when you can typically say that they have estrogen flowing pretty strongly through their bodies at that point. For males, we know that the important sex hormone, or the hormone that we hear a lot about, is testosterone. And males contain very high levels of testosterone relative to females. Females do have some testosterone, but it's small in comparison to males. This hormone is, again, responsible for secondary sexual characteristics as well. In males, you may notice that they'll have a deepening of the voice. They may have increased body hair. You'll see a growth spurt, see increased facial hair, and you may also see some acne on their face. That's usually because that testosterone usually works on sweat glands as well, which can cause acne. Testosterone affects every organ or every tissue in the body, and it's important to know that males secrete or have 10 times more testosterone than females.
Wow.
Okay. Now, there's some key structures in the brain, and one of those structures is the hypothalamus that I mentioned. This hypothalamus pretty much links the central nervous system to the endocrine system. Okay, and it regulates blood pressure, heart rate, sexual arousal, and sleep-wake cycles. Another key structure in the brain. This is the structure that not many people know about or not many people consider. We always hear about the hypothalamus and this release of all of these hormones and everything during puberty, but there's an important structure called the prefrontal cortex.
I'm familiar with that.
Right. This prefrontal cortex, there's been a lot of research that's been done recently on the prefrontal cortex, research coming out of Harvard, MIT, University of Pittsburgh. There's a lot of research that's happening right now with the prefrontal cortex. Specifically, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for things like controlling impulses, inhibiting inappropriate behavior, stopping activities upon completion, shifting and adjusting behavior or in certain situations. It's also responsible for providing a temporary mental working space. It's responsible for organizing things, planning behavior, setting priorities, carrying out tasks, setting goals.
You call it the CEO
exactly.
of the brain, and that's probably really what kind of keeps me in business a lot for youth assistance is kids making poor judgments and not really thinking everything all the way through. This is the part that should say stop. Now you're saying this part takes longer to develop?
Right. So it's important to realize that the brain pretty much develops posterior to anterior. So basically from the back to the front. That's the way that the brain develops. Now the prefrontal cortex is at the front of the brain. So relative to the other portions of the brain, this part of the brain is kind of lagging behind a little bit. Now, we talked about that hypothalamus, which gets going. It produces all those hormones and everything. Now, that hypothalamus is going pretty strong during puberty or adolescence, okay? Whereas this prefrontal cortex hasn't quite caught up yet. And we named some of the things that this prefrontal cortex was responsible for. Now, you couple that with some of the things that a child is dealing with when it comes to adolescence or puberty, and it just kind of makes it a little challenging. It lets you know that they're gonna need a little bit of help going through this.
And just to kind of slow down for one moment here, but when people make mistakes, this is where they go, oh man, I should have thought of that, and that's the prefrontal cortex right up there, right?
Right.
So they're like, man, that was a silly mistake or something for me to do, and prefrontal cortex.
Exactly. It's what carries out executive functions. That's what people in science call it. They call those functions executive functions, where you're able to basically control yourself or do higher level thinking. Okay. There was actually an example of a man named Phineas Gage back in the 1800s. He was a railroad worker, and he one day he had a tamping iron, and this tamping iron inadvertently went through the bottom portion of his chin and up through the top of his skull. Now, he was left relatively unconscious briefly, but after a while he was able to stand up and he was able to speak and everything. And he actually lived another 13 years after this incident happened. Now imagine a tamping iron, a large rod, rocketing through your chin and through your head. This guy was actually able to still live after that. But the thing is the people who knew him well, they said that he wasn't the same man after the incident. I mean, he was still able to speak, and physically he was able to do things, but there were some things that they noticed about him with his personality. They said that he went from being a diligent and responsible person to an extremely impulsive and ill-mannered person. They said he was unable to follow through on obligations. Basically, he had a damaged prefrontal cortex. Okay, that's what the conclusion has been since, is that he had a damaged prefrontal cortex. He didn't have the ability to carry out those executive functions. His CEO, so to speak, was damaged. Okay. There's a few other key structures in the brain. One of those is called the limbic system. It's composed of a portion of the brain that's called the amygdala. This is important for processing fear and reward, and it also helps to process emotional reactions. You also have a portion of this limbic system that's called the hippocampus. And I encourage parents to, when we were at our parent youth retreat, out at Machindo, the parents were saying these words, and I encourage you at home or anyone who's watching to kind of say these words because they're kind of difficult to say, but if you kind of say them and get a firm grasp on them, it'll allow you to kind of look at your parents and say, okay, or at your child and say, okay, there's a prefrontal cortex working, there's the hippocampus working, you know what I mean, to kind of get an idea, kind of play around with it. But the hippocampus is responsible for long-term memory. And there's another important portion of this limbic system that's called the nucleus accumbens. Okay. And it's responsible for reward, pleasure, and addiction. Okay. Now again, we said that the prefrontal cortex was lagging a little bit behind, but these other portions of the brain that we're mentioning, those are a little bit more developed. Those are more well developed than the prefrontal cortex.
So if I understand this right, this is where a big problem lies, because the part of the brain that deals with pleasure and feeling good, that starts working before the thought process of really like right or wrong fully.
Mm-hmm. Right. This is true. There was a study that was done on some rats in 1954 that just showed how important this nucleus accumbens was and how it can affect a person. In 1954, researchers placed electrodes into a rat's brain. They placed these electronic electrodes basically into the rat's brain, into the nucleus accumbens, and they had a lever in the rat's cage where the rat was able to push the lever or pull the lever, and every time the rat pulled the lever, these electrodes in the rat's brain would fire and activate this pleasure and addiction center, the nucleus accumbens. The rats activated this lever or pulled this lever so frequently that they ignored everything else around them.
So that was more important to them than eating?
Than anything else. They ignored, totally neglected everything else around them so that they can pull this lever and get this pleasure constantly. Okay. So imagine, and I'm not saying that our teens have or our adolescents have a lever in their brain or electrodes in their brain or anything like that, but to have the ability to say, okay, I'm experiencing this pleasure now, I need to step back and realize the consequences of me experiencing this pleasure. That's what we're saying parents need to be aware of. Kids don't always, or adolescents don't always have that ability to say, I need to step back. This may seem pleasurable for the moment, but I'm neglecting other more important things that may affect me in the future.
Right. Well, I'm thinking a couple of things here. One I could be considering like a addiction, like drug use, if it is very pleasurable to the brain, or also something else that feels really good, because you hear parents say, they played video games for like 12, 14 straight hours, and so it's like they're getting that pleasure from that and neglecting everything else. Exactly. Everything else in their life, they're not like taking showers or doing their homework or what have you. So
right.
Is that how that connects to that?
I think that you could make those kinds of comparisons.
Okay.
I think you can. So to kind of put it all together, the prefrontal cortex is basically the part of the brain that's at the front of the brain. It's at the front of the brain, and the brain develops from the back to the front. And the prefrontal cortex develops basically later than many of the other portions of the brain. Now, because of this, because we know this and we understand this, we have to understand that our youth are much more vulnerable to participating in risk-taking behavior, high-risk behavior, participating in things that could affect them long-term that they may not, it'll be very difficult for them to recover from.
Like, for instance, when you say that, what are you thinking of some of the behaviors?
Well, let's consider that, and this is according to the United States Department of Health and Human Services, mortality rates in 15 to 24-year-olds. It actually triples in 15 to 24-year-olds compared to children. It triples, okay? Injury, it's also important to realize that injury and violence are the leading causes of death in adolescence, okay? The leading causes of death in adolescence: motor vehicle crashes, homicides, suicides, okay? Those are, and a lot of the reason for a lot of these deaths, the motor vehicle accidents, so to speak. I was reading an article recently where a mother was in the car with her son, and she said that he was a straight-A student, he got good grades, he was involved in so many activities, he was a great kid. But he was driving the car, and immediately they got into a car accident because he made one split bad decision. Now, it just kind of shows you that, yeah, our youth can be well developed, but they still are prone to this risk-taking behavior or making decisions that may lead to catastrophic events, okay, like car accidents, homicides, suicides. There's also risky sexual behaviors that we know that our adolescents or teens are prone to participating in. Again, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, almost half of the 19 million newly diagnosed sexually transmitted diseases each year, half of them are usually in 15 to 24-year-olds. So of 19 million cases, you have about 10 million that are diagnosed in 15 to 24-year-olds, adolescents. Okay, so that's the biggest chunk of the pie, so to speak.
And once again, it just goes back to the immediate gratification, not putting in the thought of potential consequences, to the behavior. So it's like, what can I get right now? Concerned about right now.
Exactly. Then there's also, as far as teens, there's over 470,000 births to teens, or teens give birth to over 470,000 children annually. They also teens are responsible for over 500,000 abortions annually. So again, risk-taking behavior can lead to consequences that are, pretty difficult to recover from. Then there's teens and drugs. The average use the average first drug use, is usually the age of 18. This was from a study done in 2003. It's also important to know that 1 in 5 teens smoke cigarettes. 1 in 10 teens have used ecstasy. See, and it's important to also realize that these behaviors typically start at around this age in adolescence. A person who is 40 or 50 years old, it's not very likely that they're going to just start smoking or start, participating in certain behaviors out of nowhere. Usually these things start pretty young.
Now, did you say the first age is 18?
Well, for drug use. It's usually
drug use. Okay.
A study done in 2003 showed that the average first drug use is 18 in most kids.
All right. So parents, if their 13 or 14-year-old is getting caught with marijuana or alcohol or abusing a prescription medication, doctor, you're going to have to kind of give some people some tips what to do here. If a parent already finds out that their 13 or 14-year-old is using alcohol or marijuana or smoking this K2 or abusing a prescription medication, using somebody's that's not theirs, the family's going to need to kind of go out and get some additional education and support and assistance in dealing with these matters.
Definitely. And you guys have a great program here, that could potentially, or that can help parents who have youth that are dealing with these kinds of situations. We also have the church, or Annapolis Park Church of Christ, which is a wonderful resource. It's helped my family tremendously to stay away from some of the snares and some of the temptations that are out there. There's a number of different community resources out there, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on, and how important these resources are as far as for keeping our children away from these.
So parents really have to educate themselves to educate and take care of their kids.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, good deal.
Definitely. Another thing is that was studied or shown was that 60% of teens said that drugs were sold, kept or used at their schools. I think that's very interesting. The teens are just bombarded with these kinds of things, and you bombard teens with these kinds of things, and then have them where they're a little bit more vulnerable to actually participate in these things. It's just not a very good combination. So again, it's up to parents to realize that these things are out there and realize that their children have these vulnerabilities. We can't turn a blind eye to it, but we have to realize that they have these vulnerabilities, and then we have to face it head on. Again, parenting isn't for cowards. You have to face it head on.
Okay.
So there's actually risk factors that there's things that place adolescents at an increased risk for participating in illicit drug use or tobacco use. One of those things is genetic predisposition. Okay, there are just some families who are genetically predisposed, and again, this is empowering. If I see that mom or dad struggle with this, that should tell me I need to stay away from it. That should tell me that I may be genetically predisposed to participating in certain behaviors, illicit drug use, high-risk behaviors, alcohol use, there's certain things that I should be able to tell, or even mental illness, I should be able to say, okay, I have to stay away from certain things because I know that mom or dad struggle with those things. Another risk factor for illicit drug use or tobacco use is the use of drugs, tobacco, and smoking by family and friends. If you place those things around a child and they have those vulnerabilities with that prefrontal cortex not working, as strongly or as well as it could be, you can see the recipe for disaster there. Okay, easy access, that's another risk factor. Also, another key thing that we mentioned already, low levels of parental involvement. As I said earlier, we realize at Annapolis Park the importance of having our parents involved. That's why at our parent youth meeting that we have every fourth Sunday of the month, we actually have it to where it's parents and youth together, learning the same thing, getting on the same page, looking at each other face to face and talking things out and trying to understand each other. That's why it's very important that we have high levels of parental involvement. It actually keeps our youth out of a lot of trouble. And poverty is also a risk factor for illicit drug use or tobacco use. Now, with respect to alcohol, first alcohol use is usually a little younger than when first drug use is. First alcohol use is usually around the age of 13.
Okay, well, when you mentioned drug before, I always consider alcohol to be a drug.
Oh, definitely.
And so I think that's what kind of threw me off a little bit before.
And I consider it to be a drug too, but by society, when you see alcohol, a lot of times it's not listed as an illicit drug.
Okay.
But
primarily
clinically speaking,
because it's legalized.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly. So 71% of teens, get this, 71% of teens have had a drink prior to leaving high school. That's a lot. 71%.
But that means 29% haven't.
That means 29% haven't. Maybe those 29%, maybe their parents were aware of the prefrontal cortex.
And maybe that 29% is the one I want my youngster associating with.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And I do believe that the more that parents understand, and youth, we can't just say parents, but parents and youth. That's why the title of the lesson is Parents and the Adolescent Brain. Parents and youth need to understand their vulnerabilities and come to grips with them, and parents need to understand that the youth have these vulnerabilities. And the sooner that happens, that 71%, it'll start to trickle down, hopefully. The sooner that the society just realizes that teens aren't young adults. Just because physically they look like adults, that doesn't mean that they're young adults. There's also some risk factors for alcohol use. Again, genetic predisposition. And these are things that have been researched, okay? This is actually from one of my textbooks in medical school. Some of this information here. It talks about how use and abuse of alcohol by parents and peers is also a risk factor. And again, low levels of parental involvement. It seems like that theme just continues, this low levels of parental involvement when it comes to kids being lured into or starting to do things like use alcohol or participate in illicit drug use.
Well, the way my mind's working right now, and I'm not sure if it factors in there, but I'm like, okay, these are the things that contribute to the dangers, but I'm thinking from a parent perspective, and I'm just thinking, okay, involvement, don't let them push you away. Educate yourself of what the brain goes through and the possible risks out there, and then the main one that you really work at is communication.
Yes. That
you have to communicate with your kids.
Yes. So, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because just recently, and this is just amazing, at our past parent-youth meeting, we stressed the importance of communication between parents and youth. We went over in-depth lessons or in-depth examples where parents were actually able to sit down with their youth and discuss some of the important aspects of communication. And communication is very important.
One of the, and sorry to get off topic a little bit, but in our programming at Youth Assistance, and it's uncomfortable at first for some people, but then they end up having a really good time out of it. But we'll role play, but we'll switch roles, and we'll have the kids be the parent. And I think a lot of times they kind of act out how they see the parent at home. Well, the parent doesn't really see themselves as my way or the highway, or snapping too quick, or saying no even before the kid is finished with something. But it takes practice, and I like how that's how to help put people in a safer or a better spot to succeed.
Right. So we talked about some of the things that actually place a youth at risk for some of these things, for this high-risk behavior. But there are some things that, of course, can be done to protect against these things. Some of these things include a stable home environment. That is very key, a stable home environment.
So and I know you do this when you tell parents as well as an elder that you have to take care of you, and you have to make sure you're doing the right things in your life so you can take care of your kids or other people.
Precisely. And children draw lessons from those examples as well, or lack thereof. And for parents, what we do as parents sometimes speaks a lot louder than what we say. Okay. And just to be consistent in terms of the responsibility of caring for ourselves, making sure we're eating right and getting proper rest and getting exercise, and also managing our relationships with others in a productive and in a civil way, all plays in. And just a note on the communications issue, we've noted in our parent-youth meetings, and as we work through trying to help the parents and the children develop more effective communications capabilities, which goes to the core of oftentimes maintaining or building good relationships, is that oftentimes I think what parents don't realize is that the children, and it's interesting that you would do the switching of the roles of the parent and the child, is oftentimes the parents will not realize that children go through a lot of rough terrain themselves throughout the day. And sometimes that difficult response, or that lack of response, or what seems to be a disrespectful response, is not really an expression of disrespect or an act of rebellion as much as it is an inability to articulate and an inability to filter and deal with maybe some difficult encounters that they had throughout the day. And we find that that happens a fair amount of times. And what happens is that because of the failure of the parents to recognize that, the tension between the parent and the child escalates. And then after a while, you can't really remember what the source was, and yet the child is still left counseled, without counsel, in terms of dealing with that difficult situation, emotional situation that produces other problems.
And they might even be in more trouble because they came home and kind of acted out. And one of the things I tell parents a lot is when they're frustrated, sometimes kids don't tell you verbally what they're going through, but kids have a marvelous ability to try to get their parent or caregiver to feel how they're feeling.
Yes.
And so if they're like slamming doors on them or excluding them, that might be kind of a hint or a clue what the child has been going through.
Exactly.
So, and I didn't mean to cut you short there, Dr. James. I just think stable environment just has so many realms involved with it, and especially when you consider how hard it is to be a parent with, maintaining employment and with, a tough economy and providing for your kids and being there, emotionally for them too, and trying to surround them with good things. So I'll let you get back to that. But thank you.
Just to kind of piggyback on that, there's something interesting. There's studies going on called functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's like a functional MRI.
Okay.
And what that's doing is basically allowing scientists to determine what parts of the brain are active in certain situations. Speaking on this communication, we all know that nonverbals are a form of communication. Okay. They did a study where they had youth or adolescents look at different facial expressions, and they had to try to interpret what their facial expression was. Mm-hmm. They also had parents do the exact same thing. They had to try to determine what someone's facial expression was. Now, during this study, they realized that parents more often use their prefrontal cortex to determine or decide what the person's facial expression was, whereas the youth or the adolescent used a totally different part of the brain, the amygdala specifically. Now, and most of the time, the youth was wrong, or a lot of times the youth was wrong in their interpretation of the person's facial expression.
The youth probably said happy, angry, or sad, because that's usually what they identify.
So, I mean, I just brought that up just because it's just another layer that kind of shows that even when a youth is kind of communicating with their parent, they aren't necessarily even using their prefrontal cortex to determine what is my parent feeling or experiencing right now. Right. You know, whereas a parent is more able to look at their child and say, my child feels sad. My child, based on his facial expression, his body language, he appears to be sad. He appears to be happy. He appears to feel good. Because they're using their prefrontal cortex most of the time. Whereas the youth, on the other hand, is using a different part of the brain. They're not kind of activating that prefrontal cortex. More often, as this study showed, they were using the amygdala. And they ended up being wrong a lot of times when it came to interpreting the person's behavior. So I think it's interesting that you bring that up.
And if I might add, that is an important feature and aspect of, and why this kind of information is so important to parents, and why we just felt that this information really about the adolescent brain really needs to reach as many homes, as many lives as possible, both parents and teens, is because usually children are responding emotionally. They're not responding with referencing principles and philosophy and laws. They're driven by the hypothalamus, by the desire for pleasure, by the desire for gratification, by the desire to avoid pain, and that sort of thing. And when we forget, or we don't know that the prefrontal cortex, that governor that says yes, you're a little tired right now, but you still got to do your homework. Yes, you want to have some fun now, but you need to cut the grass, or whatever the case may be.
It's delaying gratification, and that fits into the other part where younger people have a harder time delaying gratification. Right. And as adults, we know we got to work hard all week in order so we can go to the Lions game on Sunday. So.
Right. And it's important for the parents not to get emotional with the children.
Exactly.
They have to be now, as Dr. James says, their prefrontal cortex. Exactly. To say they're missing it right now, and if I get emotional with them, then we're going to both get lost in emotions, and we're going to destroy our relationship. A parent can actually destroy their ability to communicate with their child and actually create dislike in the heart of their child toward them because they're not connecting with them.
What you say there, Mr. Mungo, is so important, and that's usually what we see when folks are coming to us. A lot of times the parent is just so upset with their child, and it is human nature to kind of get emotional. And as adults, I guess we really have to challenge our parents to use all parts of their brains and focus on the behavior and not the person, or else sometimes relationships become so strained. It takes so much more work to try to get it back to where it was.
That's true. And that's why, again, we stress the things that protect against these risk factors that we're talking about. Okay. Good communication, parental supervision, good parental involvement. That's one of the things that protects against these kinds of behaviors.
So when you say supervision, you mean like be aware where your kids are going, who they're with, check with people. And as a doctor, you're saying, this is for your child's well-being. This is something you should do. How about when kids say, "Oh, my parent was snooping through my room"? Do you think a parent should be able to do that?
Well, if you want to know my opinion,
I'm asking your doctor.
In my household, because I pay the mortgage, I just look at it like it's my room. I say that jokingly, but that's what this parental involvement is. It's going in there and really being involved in your child's life and not counting on them to parent themselves and govern themselves. It's good to actually go in and make sure that you're taking a look around the bedroom or wherever they like to spend a lot of time and making sure that everything's okay in there. It's a part of parenting.
Yeah. And the necessity, there's a necessity and a responsibility for parents to know what's going on with their children,
Exactly.
to know what's in their bedrooms, to know what's being communicated and or transmitted
Exactly.
back and forth in their cell phones. We had at our recent parent youth conference this past April, we had Ralph Elizondo, attorney Ralph Elizondo, who is the key prosecutor. He does prosecute all of the criminal sexual conduct cases for juveniles in Wayne County. And he brought to our attention that what he's beginning to see now are photographs of parts of the body that's considered pornography.
Absolutely.
And that's considered transmitting and communicating pornography using communications to do so. And, of course, that's illegal to traffic pornography. And children are not, because their prefrontal cortex is not working well, they're getting so much pleasure. The hypothalamus, is that, what was the
nucleus accumbens and the hypothalamus
is creating the hormones that create the pleasure and that chemical that makes you feel real good. This is, you get fun. If you feel good when you're having fun. And they're not thinking that the parents can be held responsible for that. Not only can they get in trouble, but Mr. Elizondo from the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office said that the parents, that's the cell phone is in the name of the parent, you're responsible for it. So now you got to prove that you didn't know that your child was receiving and transmitting pornography via the telephone. So you better know. And also, Paul, if the police had a lead that there was drugs in the house, the police can get a warrant and come in that house and go through everything in that house. And if they find drugs, and the parents can be held responsible for that as well.
Okay, well, the mortgage is under Dr. James. So he pays a mortgage on that one. But from an attorney, this is really important. So it's not like, hey, I'm just trying to make your life miserable. I'm trying to protect you and keep you safe and get some proof and validity that you are doing the best as you can right now and just kind of building that trust. Well, we're kind of running short of time, so I'm going to encourage you to keep going with this part here.
Okay. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about some of those things that help to protect against some of those risky behaviors. Another one of those things is membership in positive social organizations or positive organizations. If you have programs like the Westland Youth Assistance Program, take advantage of those things if possible.
Or sports or clubs or the library, something that's organized.
Exactly.
And it could be karate, Zumba, it could be tutoring, any number of different things. But so you're saying from a doctor's point, keep your kids involved in a lot of activities.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I always mention, at Annapolis Park, we have a number of things that our children are able to be involved in. Every third Sunday or third Saturday, we're making sure that our youth has some place to go. They are able to come out and have a picnic and just fellowship with other people who are trying to do the right thing. We also have different classes and meetings where our youth are able to actually come and attend. It kind of keeps them busy, keeps them out of trouble. Another thing, academic achievement. That's another thing that tends to keep people out of trouble. When people are focusing on their academics and trying to attain a high academic level, that's another thing that tends to keep youth out of business.
So parents should really encourage to do everything they can to do as well as they can in school.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And also association with abstinent peers.
The good kids.
Exactly.
Hang out with the good kids.
If you hang around, we've all heard the saying, one bad apple spoils the bunch. And that's true. If you're around one person or people, that are participating in some of these high-risk behavior, whether it's, high-risk sexual activity or illicit drug use, tobacco use, or alcohol use, or if they want to go out and party all the time and don't want to focus on their academics or don't want to go to church, it's very likely that you're going to start to do the same things. So stay away from, those peers or those people who tend to, want to do those kinds of things. Don't think that you have to go out and save the world, by trying to kind of lead a person away from that. Your example alone can be enough. And finally, it's important for parents to recognize the vulnerabilities of their youth, and for youth as well to recognize their vulnerabilities. If you look at these things that we've presented, they're very objective, adolescents. They're very, very objective. This isn't my opinion or Mr. Mungo's opinion or Mr. Mott's opinion. These are studies from very, very intelligent people. And we're just asking you that you realize that you're vulnerable to things out there. Realize that you need your parents, you need adults in your life who are going to guide you, the way that you need to go. And parents, again, realize that your children has these vulnerabilities and they need you, and it's very important for parents to realize that.
Well, thank you. I think this is very, very impactful, and I'm very, very pleased with the information that was delivered by you today, Dr. James. And I want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything you'd like to summarize as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I'd like to just express our appreciation to you, Ms. Motz, for having us on. We just feel such a strong and insatiable need for this kind of information to get out there. As you know, our youth are. The statistics, the negative statistics, far outweigh, unfortunately, the positive ones. Depending upon the demographic groups, even worse. And we want to set an environment, and I know we work very diligently at Annapolis Park Church of Christ to create an environment where we are a source of information. And a lot of times we just lack information. And from that information, we're going to be better able to regulate how we, what kind of environments and parameters that we set for our children. And it's hard for me to believe that there's not one parent out there that doesn't love their child, that they need the kind of tools that you offer in the Westland Youth Assistance program, which is just a marvelous program. I mean, they don't even have to be in the criminal justice system to come to you. Just be what we call not willing to listen to the parents, And oftentimes parents are struggling. I have a child that's just incorrigible. I can't talk to them. And I don't know that there are many parents out there that understand that that's enough to bring them to you. Am I correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And then, of course, the church, we have parent youth meetings every fourth Sunday. We cover everything from finances, education, sex and hygiene, drugs, communications. And we have parents who have been involved in this kind of format for quite a while and have actually benefited, have seen their relationships with their children improve because of this just knowledge. And then, as you say, doing role plays to make graphic, the nuances of critical key communication opportunities, with our children. And even to the point now, we teach at the Annapolis Park Church of Christ that our teenagers are not to even date until they're ready to get married, because it produces an opportunity for the hypothalamus, which is far more developed, and the desire for pleasure is far more developed than that governor that would restrain them from engaging in activities, which, by the way, is illegal for most children.
Well, Dr. Cornelius James, it's been a pleasure having you on here today. A wealth of information, and you guys are really a great duo and pair that you work with, and I really enjoyed our meetings before. And Mr. Mungo, you're wonderful, and I hope to have you guys on the show again for the future. So